Welcome to Wild Human Stories. My name is Lena, and I will be narrating your story today.
He let 20 freezing cubs into his cabin. By morning, he was the chosen one. The wind howled against the reinforced hull of the outpost, a shrieking reminder that K9 was a world never meant for the living. Inside, Elias adjusted the thermal regulator with a steady hand, his eyes fixed on the flickering sensors. The ion storm had dropped temperatures to a level that would turn Draxal blood to slush in seconds. He heard the scratching first, a desperate, frantic sound against the airlock. When he cycled the sensors, he didn't see a boarding party. He saw heat signatures, small, fatting, and terrified. 20 of them. Without a second thought, Elias overrode the safety protocols. The airlock hissed open, and a blast of lethally cold air surged into the cabin. He hauled them in, one by one, small reptilian bodies shivering so hard their scales rattled like dry leaves. He didn't care that they were the brood of the very species currently contesting this sector. They were cold, and he was a human with a furnace in his chest. "Move to the central vent," Elias commanded, his voice gruff but low to avoid scaring the hatchlings. He didn't use a translator. He used his hands, scooping up the smallest ones and tucking them against his flight jacket. The heat from his skin radiated through the fabric, and the cub let out a soft, trilling hiss of disbelief. Humans were biological anomalies, heat wasters who bled warmth into the atmosphere like a broken radiator. To a Draxal, this was a resource beyond price. He spent the next 4 hours stripping his own bedding, creating a communal nest over the heating grate, and sharing his ration packs. He moved with a quiet, deliberate efficiency, his large frame casting long shadows against the bulkhead. He was a predator by design, but a guardian by choice. By the time the Draxal recovery shuttle docked, the storm had broken. The airlock didn't cycle gently. It was blown inward by a breaching charge. Aayla stepped through the smoke, her serrated combat blade drawn, her amber eyes slit with lethal intent. She expected to find a massacre or a hostage situation. Instead, she found the human captain sitting on the floor, leaning against a crate. He was stripped down to a thin undershirt, his skin flushed red from the heat he was generating. The 20 cubs were draped over him, sleeping in a pile of warm, rhythmic breathing. One was curled around his neck like a scarf. "You took them," Aayla said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. She stepped closer, the magnets on her boots clanking against the floor. "They were dying," Elias replied, not moving a muscle to avoid waking the cub on his shoulder. He looked up at her, his blue eyes steady and devoid of the fear she was used to seeing in lesser species. "The storm would have claimed them in 10 minutes, Elias added, his voice rasping from the dry heat. Aayla paused, her gaze traveling from the sleeping brood to the man. She had never seen a human this close, let alone one in such a state of intentional vulnerability. The sheer amount of thermal energy rolling off him was intoxicating to her cold-blooded senses. Her own scales began to itch with a sudden, primal need to be near that heat. "You risked your life for the offspring of an enemy," Aayla noted, sheathed her blade, though her posture remained tense. "I don't see enemies when things are freezing to death," Elias said, slowly standing up while supporting a cub in his arms. He stepped toward her, and Aayla found herself rooted to the spot. As he neared, the warmth hitting her face was like a physical caress. It was a thick, heavy heat smelling of salt and the synthetic musk of his jacket. "Take them," Elias told her, holding out the cub. Their fingers brushed during the transfer. The contact was electric. Ayla's breath hitched, a sharp intake of air that made her chest plate rattle. His skin was scorching, a vibrant, living heat that felt like a sun had been trapped in a jar. She stared at his hand, then at his face. In Draxal culture, the one who provides life during the great cold is the chosen. It was an ancient, nearly forgotten law, rendered obsolete by technology, yet her DNA was screaming. "You are coming with us," Aayla declared, her voice dropping an octave. "Is this an arrest?" Elias asked, a small, tired smirk playing on his lips. "It is a claim," Aayla replied, her tail twitching with an agitation she couldn't suppress. The transport back to the Draxal flagship, the Obsidian Wing, was silent but charged with a tension that made the air feel thick. Elias sat in the center of the hold, surrounded by the cubs who refused to leave his side. Aayla watched him from the command dais, her eyes never leaving the pulse point at his neck. She could see the blood pumping there, a frantic, warm rhythm. Her species thrived on logic and conquest, but the human was a walking contradiction. He was strong enough to crush a cub's skull, yet he had used his own body to keep them from the frost. When they reached the flagship, Aayla bypassed the brig. She led him directly to her private sanctum, a room usually kept at a temperature that would make a human sweat within minutes. "Why am I here, Commander?" Elias asked, looking around the stark, metallic room. Aayla turned, her cape falling away to reveal the sleek, powerful lines of her armor. She began to unclip the chest plate, the metal clattering as it hit the floor. "In our legends, the bringer of warmth is the one who leads," Aayla said, stepping into his personal space. She was taller than him, her movements fluid and predatory. She reached out, her clawed fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Her touch was cool, but where she touched him, her skin began to absorb his heat hungrily. "You saved the future of my house," Aayla whispered, her face inches from his. "I just did what any human would do," Elias muttered, his breath hitching as her thumb moved over his lower lip. "That is why your species is terrifying," Aayla replied, her eyes darkening. She pressed her palm against his chest, right over his heart. The heat there was a thumping, powerful force. She could feel the way he reacted to her, the way his pupils dilated, the way his skin grew even hotter. It wasn't just biology, it was a choice. He was letting her in. "Show me this human excellence," Aayla challenged, her voice a silken growl. Elias didn't hesitate. He reached up, his large hands gripping her waist. He pulled her flush against him, and Aayla let out a genuine moan of shock. The contact was total. Through his shirt, the heat of his torso flooded into her, a golden tide that seemed to wash away the perpetual chill of her existence. "Careful what you wish for, Commander," Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register. He leaned in, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of her neck. Ayla's head fell back, her scales shimmering under the harsh lights of the room. She felt a surge of something she had no name for, a fierce, protective desire for the man who had protected her kin. The political fallout was immediate. The Hegemony demanded the human be turned over for interrogation. Ayla's response was a broadcast sent to the entire fleet. She stood on the bridge, Elias standing just behind her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. "The human, Elias Thorne, is under the protection of the High Commander," Aayla announced, her voice echoing through the comms. "He is the chosen," she added, a term that caused a ripple of shock through the Draxal ranks. On the screen, the High Inquisitor hissed, his frills expanding in rage. "You would side with a mammal, a creature of soft skin and wasted energy," the Inquisitor demanded. "This mammal survived the storm that would have killed our strongest warriors," Aayla countered, her eyes flashing. "He didn't survive it with armor or shields," she said, looking back at Elias. "He survived it with his own blood," she finished, her voice thick with pride. Elias stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He wasn't a diplomat, but he knew how to lead. "We aren't here to take your worlds," Elias said, his voice carrying the weight of human resolve. "But if you touch a single cub of this house, you'll find out exactly how much heat a human can generate when we're angry," Elias warned. The transmission cut. Aayla turned to him, her heart, or the Draxal equivalent, pounding. The way he had stood for her people, was a display of dominance that transcended species. "You spoke well," Aayla said, her tail wrapping around his leg. "I spoke the truth," Elias replied, his eyes searching hers. He reached out, pulling her into a fierce embrace. In the privacy of the bridge, with the stars screaming past them in hyperspace, the boundaries of their species dissolved. Aayla pressed her face into his chest, inhaling the scent of him, smoke, salt, and the intoxicating aroma of a living fire. "I have never felt full before," Aayla admitted, her voice muffled against his shirt. "It's called being warm, Aayla," Elias said, his hands moving rhythmically down her back, smoothing over the hard scales until she shivered. "Is it always like this for you?" Aayla asked, looking up at him with a vulnerability that would have ended her career if seen by anyone else. "Only when it matters," Elias replied. He kissed her then, a deep, bruising contact that tasted of iron and heat. Aayla responded with a ferocity that nearly knocked him back. She was a creature of the cold, learning for the first time what it meant to burn. Her claws snagged in his hair, but she was careful, her movements guided by a new, human-taught tenderness. The ship rattled as they exited hyperspace near the human frontier. A fleet of Terran destroyers sat waiting, their railguns cold but ready. "They'll think you've captured me," Elias said, breaking the kiss but keeping her close. "Let them think what they want," Aayla said, her eyes fixed on the human ships. "I am going to tell them that the Draxal are no longer your enemies," she decided. "And how will you convince them?" Elias asked, a smirk touching his lips. Aayla looked at the 20 cubs who had followed them onto the bridge, now healthy and vibrant, huddling near the human heat vents. "I will show them what you did," Aayla said. "And I will show them what you have done to me," she whispered, leaning into him. The negotiation was tense. General Vance of the Terran Alliance stared at the screen, his eyes widening as he saw the Draxal High Commander standing side by side with a missing human captain. "Captain Thorne, report," Vance barked. "Sir, the situation has evolved," Elias said, clearing his throat. "The Draxal are requesting a formal alliance," Elias explained. "On what grounds?" Vance asked, looking skeptical. Aayla stepped forward, her hand finding Elias and interlacing their fingers, a gesture she had learned from him. "On the grounds that your species possesses a biological imperative that we lack," Aayla said. "You call it mercy," she continued. "We call it the power of the chosen," she stated. Vance looked at their joined hands, then at the cubs playing on the Draxal bridge. The sheer absurdity of the image was enough to make the veteran soldier pause. "You saved their kids, Elias?" Vance asked, his voice softening. "They were cold, General," Elias said simply. That simplicity was what broke the tension. It was the human way, to look at a galaxy of monsters and see something that needed a coat. As the treaties were signed and the first human Draxal trade routes were established, the story of the chosen human became a legend. But for Elias and Aayla, the galaxy-defining events were secondary to the quiet moments in their shared quarters. Aayla lay stretched out on the thermal furs, her skin glowing from the proximity of the man beside her. Elias was reading a digital pad, but his other hand was tracing patterns on her arm. "The High Inquisitor is still complaining about the human influence in the fleet," Aayla remarked, her eyes half-closed in contentment. "What's he upset about now?" Elias asked, not looking up. "The soldiers have started carrying portable heaters for the local wildlife," Aayla said, a small smile appearing. "They say it's human-style tactics," she added. Elias laughed, a deep, rich sound that made Ayla's chest hum in response. "We're a bad influence," Elias admitted. "No," Aayla said, turning onto her side and pinning him to the furs. "You are a necessary one," she corrected. She pressed her body against his, the contrast of her cool scales and his burning skin creating a sensation that made her vision swim. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her eyes locked on his. "You gave my people a future, Elias," Aayla whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Now give me mine," she demanded. Elias dropped the pad, his hands finding the curve of her hips. The room was silent except for the hum of the ship and the synchronized beating of two very different hearts. In the years that followed, the alliance held. The human heat became a slang term for the unexpected compassion that redefined the sector. But the true testament to the change wasn't in the laws or the borders. It was in the way a Draxal warrior would pause before a battle to ensure the environment was safe for the weak. It was in the way they looked at humans, not as prey or as rivals, but as the fire that kept the universe from going dark. Elias stood on the balcony of the new embassy on Draxal Prime, the air crisp but manageable. Aayla joined him, her heavy cloak discarded. She didn't need it anymore. "The cubs are graduating from the academy today," Aayla said, leaning against him. "The ones from the storm," Elias asked. Yes, Aayla replied. They all want to serve on human-integrated ships, she said. They want to be where the warmth is, she added. Elias wrapped his arm around her, pulling her into the crook of his shoulder. The sun was setting over the jagged peaks of the planet, casting a long, golden light over the city. We did good, Aayla, Elias said. You did good, human, Aayla corrected, kissing his cheek. I just followed my heart, Elias said. And in doing so, you stole mine, Aayla replied, her amber eyes reflecting the glow of the sunset and the man who had changed everything. The legacy of that one cold night on K9 lived on. It wasn't the human weapons that conquered the Draxal. It was their refusal to let the fire go out. And as Elias and Aayla looked out over their shared world, they knew that as long as there was a human to offer a hand, the galaxy would never truly be cold again. The intensity of their bond grew with every passing cycle. Aayla found herself studying human history, trying to understand the depth of their capacity for sacrifice. She watched Elias interact with her subordinates, noted the way they stood straighter when he entered a room, not out of fear, but out of a desperate desire for his approval. He was the sun around which her world now orbited. One evening, as the stars twinkled through the transparent ceiling of their suite, Aayla approached him with a question that had been burning in her mind. Elias, if the roles were reversed, would you still have opened that door? She asked. Elias looked up from his work, his expression serious. Aayla, there isn't a version of me that lets children die in the cold, he said firmly. Even if they grow up to be the ones who kill you, Aayla pushed. Elias stood and walked to her, taking her hands in his. Especially then, he said. Because if I save them, maybe they won't grow up to be those people, he explained. Aayla felt a lump in her throat. The sheer optimism of it was staggering. It was a tactical risk of the highest order, one that ignored all probability for the sake of a single, beautiful possibility. You humans are insane, Aayla whispered. Maybe, Elias grinned. But you love it, he added. He pulled her into a dance, a slow, rhythmic sway that had no music other than the hum of the planet's core. Aayla rested her head on his shoulder, letting his heat seep into her very bones. She felt safe. For a Draxal High Commander, safety was a foreign concept, a luxury for the weak. But with Elias, it was her reality. As the years turned into decades, the story of the 20 cubs and the human captain became a foundational myth for the new era. Statues were erected, not of warriors with guns, but of a man in a flight jacket holding a small, shivering lizard. It became a symbol of the human exception, the idea that kindness was the ultimate weapon. Elias and Aayla grew old together, their lives a testament to the bridge they had built. When Elias finally passed, peacefully in his sleep with Aayla's hand in his, he was mourned by two worlds. Aayla didn't retreat into the cold. She stayed in the light he had created, continuing his work, ensuring that the fire he had lit on K9 would burn forever. She stood at his memorial, looking out at the diverse crowd of humans and Draxal. She didn't feel the chill of the wind. She felt the warmth of his memory, a persistent, glowing ember in her soul. He was the chosen, Aayla told the crowd, her voice strong and clear. Not because of prophecy, but because of a choice, she said. And as long as we choose to keep each other warm, he will never truly be gone, she concluded. The galaxy listened, and for the first time in eons, it felt a little less vast and a lot more like home. Would you like me to elaborate on the SB? The wind on Draxal Prime was never supposed to be warm. For eons, the homeworld of the Draxal Hegemony had been a place of jagged obsidian spires, subterranean vaults, and a sky the color of a bruised lung. It was a world where the only heat was the mechanical hum of geothermal processors, a world of hard edges and harder logic. The Draxal civilization was built on the preservation of thermal energy. To them, a waster was the lowest form of life. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon on the day of the Great Commemoration, the air around the Capitol Plaza was strangely, defiantly temperate. High Commander Aayla stood on the central dais, her scales shimmering under the artificial lights like polished jade. She was much older now, The vibrant, predatory amber of her eyes had clouded slightly with the silver frost of decades, and the ridges along her neck had hardened into the permanent armor of age. Beside her stood a statue that had become the most photographed monument in the known sector. It was not a statue of a conqueror, and it did not depict a glorious breach of enemy lines or the crushing of a rebellion. It was a man in a battered, grease-stained flight jacket, his face etched with a weary but stubborn kindness, holding a small, shivering hatchling against his chest. Aayla looked out into a crowd that would have been a biological and political impossibility 50 years prior. There were human diplomats in silk suits sitting shoulder to shoulder with Draxal generals whose ceremonial armor now included soft thermal padding, not for protection in battle, but for comfort in the presence of their allies. She recalled the time before the thaw, when the galaxy was a cold, transactional place. She told the assembled millions that they had once called Elias Thorne a heat waster. They had seen only biological inefficiency in a species that bled its life force into the atmosphere. But on that night on K9, Elias Thorne had shown them that what they called waste was actually an invitation. He hadn't just saved 20 cubs, he had taught an entire civilization how to breathe without a cold suit. In the immediate years following the incident on K9, the 20 cubs Elias had saved became the Thorne generation, a group that would eventually dismantle the very foundations of Draxal society from within. In the beginning, however, they were a political flashpoint that threatened to shatter the fragile ceasefire General Vance had negotiated. The High Inquisitor, a formidable strategist named Varkas who represented the eternal ice of the old ways, had demanded the cubs be placed in reconditioning centers. He feared that their proximity to a human had tainted their warrior spirits with a soft-skinned weakness that would spread like a plague through the Hegemony. Aayla had refused him, her voice echoing through the obsidian halls of the High Command. She claimed the cubs as her own honored brood, invoking ancient, rarely used blood laws that dated back to the nomadic eras of their species. Under these laws, the cubs were untouchable, protected by the High Commander's own life. These 20 individuals grew up to be the bridge between two worlds. The smallest of them, the one who had famously slept on Elia's shoulder and refused to move even when Aayla had approached with a bared blade, was named Kalen. Kalen did not become a soldier. He became the first Draxal neurobiologist to study the cross-species effect of thermal resonance. His life's work was dedicated to understanding the human exception. He discovered that when Draxal were raised in the presence of human thermal signatures, their amygdalas developed with a different density. They were less prone to the cold rage, that predatory fugue state that had governed Draxal warfare for millennia. Kalen's research proved that the Draxal were not inherently cruel. They were simply a species that had been stuck in a permanent biological survival mode due to the cold. He famously wrote in his journals that humanity didn't change the Draxal's nature, but rather, they finally allowed the Draxal to have a nature beyond survival. The biological revolution that followed touched every corner of both civilizations. While the cubs grew, scientists from Earth and Draxal Prime worked to unravel the mystery of why the ancient Draxal texts regarding the Chosen were so specific about a creature of inner fire. They discovered that these texts were not religious prophecies, but biological warnings from a time before the great chill of their home system. Thousands of years ago, the Draxal had been a deeply communal species, huddling together for warmth in vast, hearth circles. As they developed advanced technology, they replaced communal heat with individual mechanical processors. This technological shift led to social isolation, which in turn led to a culture of aggression and eventually, imperialism. Humanity's inefficient biology was a literal mirror of the Draxal's lost heritage. This realization led to the invention of the Thorne Grate, a piece of technology now found in every public building in the sector. It was a floor-level heating vent designed to mimic the exact thermal output and rhythmic pulse of a resting human male. To a human, it was a cozy spot to sit. To a Draxal, it was a beacon of physiological safety. When the first human Draxal embassy opened on Earth, the Draxal ambassadors spent the first hour of the grand opening lying on the floor in the Thorne Grate lounge. They were in a state of Kashar, a Draxal term for a soul thaw so profound it could stop a heart if not managed correctly. It was the sound of a billion voices finally finding a home. The political tides turned for good during the great power failure on the asteroid colony of Vesta 4. A massive solar flare had knocked out the colony's geothermal cores, and 3,000 Draxal hatchlings were at risk of freezing to death within the hour. The human transport ships were too far away to bring heavy replacement parts, but a nearby human mining crew arrived within minutes. High Inquisitor Varkas, still holding onto his bitter ideologies, had prepared to issue a mercy decree, the ritualistic culling of the weakest hatchlings to ensure the survival of the strong. However, he was stopped by a live transmission from the colony. He saw human miners who had stripped off their heavy environmental suits, standing in their undershirts in the freezing dark. They had formed a living circle around the cooling hatchling vats, pressing their bare chests and arms against the glass. They were shivering violently, their skin turning blue, but they refused to move. Varkas watched a human woman holding 4 cubs against her skin, her breath coming in ragged gasps, as she whispered human lullabies to the reptilian children. Varkas did not say a word. He watched the feed for an hour, then slowly took off his obsidian headpiece and laid it on the floor. He resigned the next day, spending his final years in a human-integrated sector, often seen wrapped in a hand-knitted wool blanket gifted to him by a human neighbor he had once called a parasitic mammal. Away from the politics and the grand monuments, Elias and Aayla lived a life that was surprisingly quiet. They settled on a small moon called Aayla, which had been terraformed to mimic the temperate forests of Earth's Pacific Northwest. Elias never quite got used to being a legend. He spent his days tinkering with old atmospheric engines and teaching Draxal teenagers how to fish in the moon's artificial lakes. He was known simply as Old Man Thorne to the locals. His cabin was always open, and there was always a pot of coffee on the stove and a warm spot on his hearth for anyone who felt the chill of the world. Aayla, having stepped down from active command to serve as the High Matriarch of the Alliance, found a peace she had never known in the military. She learned the human art of gardening, discovering a talent for growing thorn roses, a hybrid flower that would only bloom if the soil was kept at a constant 37 degrees C. Their home was a physical bridge between worlds. On the walls hung Ayla's ceremonial shard blade beside Elias' old flight helmet. On the floor was a massive, custom-built rug where the original 20 cubs, now grown adults with children of their own, would gather during the winter holidays. There was a profound role reversal in their later years. When Elias' human heart began to tire, it was Aayla who became the guardian. She used her species' advanced medical technology to supplement his failing organs, but more importantly, she used the lessons he had taught her. In the cold nights of Aayla, when the dampness seeped into Elias' bones, Aayla would wrap her massive, powerful form around him. She wasn't seeking his heat anymore. She was offering her own, generated by the internal thermal regulators he had helped design for her people. "You're a bad influence," Elias would whisper into the dark, his voice a raspy shadow of the man who had once shouted over the storm on K9. "I had a good teacher," Aayla would reply, her amber eyes glowing with a warmth that had nothing to do with technology. Elias Thorne passed away on a Tuesday in mid-autumn. He died as he lived, quietly and with no regard for the grand narrative. He simply went to sleep in his favorite chair, a book about ancient Earth sailing ships resting on his lap. The news ripple-effected across the galaxy. On Earth, the bells of every major city tolled for 21 minutes, one for Elias, and one for each of the cubs he had pulled out of the snow. On Draxal Prime, the entire planet went dark for an hour. Every light was extinguished, every heater turned off, in a collective moment of shared cold, to honor the man who had ended the Great Chill. The funeral was a warm wake. Per Elias' final wishes, thousands of humans and Draxal gathered in the forests of Aayla. They built massive bonfires that could be seen from orbit. They shared food, told stories, and slept in communal tents where the distinction between human and Draxal was lost in a tangle of limbs and blankets. Aayla stood by his casket and performed the Sawthorn, the song of the hearth. It was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the ground, a sound that expressed a gratitude too deep for words. When the casket was lowered into the earth, in a plot surrounded by 1,000 thorn roses, the 20 original cubs stood as a guard of honor. They didn't carry weapons. They carried lanterns, lit from the fire Elias had started in his cabin furnace all those years ago. 500 years later, the human Draxal War was a subject relegated to history hollows, a period of primitive darkness that students studied with a mix of horror and disbelief. K9, once a frozen wasteland of death, had been renamed Thorne's Rest. The cabin where it all began had been preserved under a permanent stasis field. It was the most visited site in the galaxy. Pilgrims from a dozen different species would come to sit on the floor of the cabin, touching the cold metal of the airlock Elias had opened against all logic and protocol. The Draxal species had changed fundamentally. Evolution, sparked by the social shift of the human exception, had accelerated. They remained strong and resilient, but the biological imperative for solitary survival had been replaced by a cultural empathy that made them the premier diplomats of the Orion Arm. In the center of the capital on Draxal Prime, the statue of Elias still stood. But it was no longer alone. Beside it was a statue of Aayla, her hand resting on his shoulder, and around them were 20 smaller statues of the cubs. At the base of the monument, an eternal flame burned. It wasn't fueled by gas or electricity. It was powered by a biological thermal converter that drew a tiny, imperceptible amount of heat from every person who walked past it. It was a literal representation of the human heat, a fire kept alive by the collective presence of the living. Ayla's final words, carved into the obsidian base of the monument, became the unofficial motto of the United Galactic Front. We were born in the cold, but we were not meant to stay there. The galaxy remained vast, and the space between stars was still terrifyingly freezing. But as long as there were doors to be opened, and as long as there were those willing to waste their warmth on the shivering, the fire of Elias Thorne would never go out. The Chosen One hadn't been a man of prophecy or a warrior of destiny. He was a man who saw 20 freezing children and realized that the furnace in his chest was meant to be shared. The story of the Chosen was a story of a choice that 1 trillion souls now made every day. The cold was gone, the light had won, and the galaxy finally felt like home.